Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. Thank you so very much for joining me this evening, wherever you are in the world. And I don't know what your time zone is, but whether it's day or night, I hope you're having a fabulous day or evening. And don't forget to get that lovely cup of hot cocoa or tea, because I've got the most fabulous story for you tonight that you're really going to love. And I send each and every one of you loads of love because you all rock, you really do. I've got the most incredible subscribers and I really appreciate each and every one of you. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Janine and I grew up in the 90s. And when I was about 7 or 8, my parents moved from Atlanta to a very exquisite area in Washington state, in a beautiful, spacious doll's house style double-storey home with a grey slate roof, whitewashed walls and square windows, along with a gleaming vintage red front door. Our enchanting postcard perfect home was set against tall hemlocks, grand firs and Douglas fir trees that stood proudly in the firmament like statuesque green giants. And if you glanced through the trees, you would see the mountainous valleys beyond, rising up in the distance like masterful blue-grey pyramids. Our property was surrounded by rolling green, perfectly manicured lawns, a small pond, and a scattering of trees and pretty colourful shrubs and garden plants, from varying shades of green to deep wines, reds and purples. On the right-hand side of the valley, there was a vast wooded area of land that was teeming with indigenous wildlife, like the occasional black bear, mule deer and white-tailed deer, beavers, moles, bobcats, cougars and coyotes, and this area was accessible to most of the people that lived in our neighbourhood and was a wonderful place for us to play as young children growing up. We were incredibly lucky because we could access this wooded area through a gate in our palisade fencing, which means we could literally leave our house and enter the woods immediately. I grew up in a quintessential family home with 2 devoted, fun-loving parents, along with my 2 younger siblings, Lydia and my brother Eddie. My parents were incredibly loving and supportive and encouraged us to be the best that we could be in life. They were both very much in love, and it was exceedingly rare for them to ever fight. And as a result, many people envied my parents' seemingly flawless and perfect marriage. One day something transpired in our home that was so utterly extraordinary that it was literally to shatter the fabric of our world apart and leave an indelible footprint on our childhoods that would never ever quite be the same again. My story begins when I was about 8 years old at the time. I woke up to hear a raucous, monstrous commotion and raised indignant voices of both my parents fighting. I was absolutely startled because I'd never heard them fight before, and those outrageous voices for the first time were very alarming. What was going on with my parents, I wondered. I noticed that both my brother and sister were fast asleep, and I was wondering whether or not to actually wake them. I decided against it, although I was surprised that the loud, disgruntled, angry voices had not aroused them from their slumber. I tiptoed towards the staircase where the white wooden railings overlooked the downstairs living area, where my parents were brawling. I have absolutely no memory of what they were actually fighting about, but they were lashing out at each other like 2 seething, aggressive, rabid dogs that wanted to tear each other apart, limb from limb. I'd never ever seen them this crazed and perturbed before. It was not a physical altercation by any manner of means, but the waspish, stinging words that they were shouting at each other seemed as harmful and deadly as any sharpened bow through my childlike eyes. I was very apprehensive and incredibly alarmed of what I was actually witnessing, as I've never seen my parents exercise such hostility towards each other before. My mother looked so enraged and so hot-tempered that her nose was flaring and her face had grown bright purple, and I remember she threw a vase of flowers at a mirror, smashing it into thousands of pieces, and the shards of glass were everywhere, and the broken vase was fragmented into so many pieces that was lying precariously over the living room floor. Then she picked up several glass goblets and threw them one at a time at the wall in an act of incandescent rage, the likes of such as I've never seen before. My father looked horrified. "Please don't do that, darling. Let's talk about this. We can work this out, I promise you. You're barking up the wrong tree, and blowing everything out of proportion. I promise you, none of it is true. Don't lie to me. Of course it's true, my mother screamed. I remember gasping in horror, hardly believing what was happening, and when my parents saw me, they became very concerned. What are you doing up, Janine? My mother asked me. It's way past your bedtime. It's already 12 o'clock. Had you not better go back to bed? Came my mother's sweet, reassuring voice that sounded far more edgy than usual. I heard you shouting at Daddy, I said. Is everything all right? Of course it is, sweetheart, said my mother, taking me in her arms and escorting me up the staircase back to my bedroom, where she tucked me back into bed. Mummy, why were you fighting with Daddy? I cried. It's nothing to worry about, sweetheart. Your Daddy and I just had an argument, but it'll be fine in the morning, I promise you, she assured me, kissing me on the cheek. But why did you throw the vase? I cried. Mummy was just venting her anger, sweetheart, but it was a very silly thing to do. My mother's words were very reassuring and comforting to me, and so I fell asleep, only to be awoken again to my mother's raised, angry voice, yet again. I'm going to bed now, Ralph, she snapped. We'll talk about this in the morning. I heard my father's feet running up the staircase. No, he said, let's talk about this now. I want to resolve this now. It's crazy to go to sleep feeling so mad at each other when this is nothing to be upset about. There's a great deal to be upset about, Rolf, came my mother's furious voice. Suddenly I heard a huge thumping noise that ominously sounded like someone had fallen down the staircase. It's a sound that I shall never forget. I immediately got up and raced to the landing. What I saw was so horrifying that I could not comprehend this chilling reality. I saw my mother lying at the bottom of the staircase, and my father was shaking her limp body and weeping and weeping. I saw him clutching my mother's lifeless body in his arms and crying. I recall my mother looked like a pale, fragile mannequin in his desperate, frantic arms. I was so terrified, I ran back to bed, only to be awoken later to the voice of my mother's sister, whom my father had obviously called around to the house. Once again I crept to the landing and looked over the wooden railings to see my father and Diane, and they were embracing and crying. I sat on the staircase, eavesdropping and listening intently to their intense conversations. We have to cover this up, I heard Diane saying to my dad. No one can know about this, or you'll go down for murder. But it was an accident, protested my father. She fell down the stairs. I didn't push her. Surely the police would understand that. You want to take that risk, snapped Diane. Supposing it all backfires on you, and you go down for life for this. It happens. Is that what you want? You know very well that Victoria would be devastated to see that happen to you. She'd never ever forgive me if I didn't protect you. What about your kids? Do you want them growing up without a father? That would be a grievous evil if ever I saw one. Those kids have lost a mother. They don't need to lose a father as well. Not if I've got anything to do with it, that is. I blame myself for all this, I heard my dad say. For goodness sake, Rolf, it was an accident. These tragic things do happen. Yes, you've lost your beautiful wife, and I've lost the most incredible sister. But we can't do anything about that now. But you can't blame yourself. It's hardly your fault. And as for Victoria, she should have trusted you more. Honestly, she should know you better than that, instead of reacting like a bull in a china shop and coming to all kinds of conclusions. Victoria was always prone to overreact. Even when we were kids growing up, she would always jump to the wrong conclusion. She was so good at that. Before long, I could see the lifeless body of my mother being rolled in an old Persian carpet, which my father and Diane seemed to be taking somewhere. I was certain they were going to bury her. After that dreadful ordeal, I'm not sure what actually happened to my memory, but I must have suppressed it for some reason, or maybe I just told myself it was all the most terrible nightmare, and it never actually happened. I was to learn later that kids do have the marvellous ability to block traumatic events from their minds, so invariably that must be what happened to me, because I kid you not, many years after this harrowing event, I remembered absolutely nothing. The next day I woke up to the delicious smell of pancakes, which Diane was serving with lashings of maple syrup and vanilla ice cream. I was thrilled because we were never usually allowed to eat ice cream at breakfast. I was surprised to see my mother was not around, and I was rather perturbed as to why Diane was there. But it's amazing how a plate of delicious-looking melt-in-the-mouth pancakes can literally throw off your thoughts. My father was looking at us very seriously as he sat down at the breakfast table, and he passed us plates of pancakes. I could see my dad's eyes look bloodshot. They were so red from crying, and he looked so despairingly sad. I knew something really bad had transpired. My brother and sister were looking at my father in dismay, because he looked so broken, downhearted, and incredibly lost. "Your mother has left us," said my father, "and she's not coming back, but she wants you to know that she really loves you very, very much indeed." "Why did she not say goodbye?" asked Eddie. "And why is she not coming back?" My father began to choke on his words as he fought back tears, and Diane immediately interjected. "Your father's right. Your mother's gone away for a very long time, but she does love you very, very much." It was all as if our probing, curious questions were being pushed away and always blocked by Diane, who seemed determined never to tell us very much. After a while as kids we stopped asking questions, and so did everybody else, as invariably people get caught up in their own lives and always get distracted. So my mother's absence in our lives did not raise too many quizzical eyebrows or curious questions, as you might imagine. And we had only been in Washington for a few months, so my mother had not made many friends, so not many people were aware that she was actually missing in the first place. I believe Diane and my father did actually file a missing persons report at the police station, but they told the police that my mother was suicidal at the time of her disappearance, and I think it was assumed that she had taken her own life, and so nothing was really done about the case, as no evidence of my mother's body was ever found. My father erected a very beautiful memorial stone for my mother at the local cemetery with its own burial plot, where it stood proudly among all the graves at the cemetery, and as children we would visit it regularly, which was rather strange because if my mother was not dead, why were we visiting her gravesite? Diane always seemed to find an answer for every single question, and she told us that a memorial stone was about remembering the person, whether they were alive or dead. Growing up, the pink elephant in the room was invariably always the subject of my mother, because if we dared mention her name, my father became so incredibly despondent that it was just so heartbreaking for us to observe that we daren't ever raise the subject again. We knew not to ever mention my mother's name. Sometimes I would see my dad flicking through photo albums of happier times with such painful looks of nostalgic yearning on his face, it was unbearable to watch. As my father worked full-time, Diane moved into our home with her long-time boyfriend Larry, and they looked after us, taking charge of the school run and managing our home, and we became like one big happy family together. Diane became like a second mother to us and Larry like a second dad, and we had a very happy, vibrant life, although I always sensed that my dad had a deep underlying sadness and grievous hurt that could never ever be dissipated no matter what. Naturally, there were times as kids, Lydia, Eddie and I would reflect about my mother and ask each other what had actually happened to her and why she left us in the way that she did. But none of us had any real answers, nor were we overly concerned, because we had a very full, jubilant and happy life, so why should we worry anyway? Growing up, we would spend ages out in the woods, and we would often take a picnic lunch with us and eat our sandwiches by the stream that meandered through the wooded valley and was surrounded by huge rocky formations that we would sit on as we watched the gushing stream with its strong, forceful, pulsating current run its watery course through the valley. As children, we enjoyed the soothing sound of the water and adored paddling in the stream and throwing small rocks in the water. Sometimes we would catch little fish with our nets and throw them back into the stream. Other times we would play hide and seek in the woods, and we would find great places to hide, such as hollows in trees and overgrown shrubbery and rocky formations. There were always fabulous hiding spots in the woods. There were occasions we would bring our board games like Snakes and Ladders or Monopoly, and we would play them together on one of the elevated, vast, smooth rocks there that was as flat as a table. We loved the woods because they were teeming with wildlife, and I especially adored squirrels because they're so cute, the way they dash so nimbly up the trees and look at you with their wide, brown, curious eyes. One day when I was about 15 years old, I woke up in a dreadful hot sweat, and I was in a huge panic. I knew that I was experiencing the most horrifying, unbelievable, dreadful nightmare. Suddenly the memory of the last night of my mother's life came flooding back with such crystal clear clarity. I could remember every single detail of that night from 12 whole long years ago. Now, how does that happen? The weird thing is that my recall did not return to me in dribs and drabs, as it invariably does for a lot of people, like a jigsaw you try to put back together again. On the contrary, it came back all at once, in such explicit detail. It was nothing short of extraordinary. I could see my mother's furious face throwing that vase at the wall, and I remember that baleful thudding sound as my mother went flying down the stairs to meet her dreadful demise. I knew it had been an awful accident, and so I wondered why on earth my father had kept it a secret from us for so long. I ran into my father's bedroom, and I shook him violently awake from his very deep sleep. He looked startled to see me waking him up so aggressively and so early in the morning. "Is everything all right, sweetheart?" he asked. "You look frantic. Has something happened?" "Dad," I shouted, I remember everything that happened the night Mum died." My father sat bolt upright in bed and said, "You remember?" "Yes, Dad, I remember, and none of it was your fault. Mum died, yes she did, but it was a terrible accident." I began to tell my father absolutely everything I remembered, and we embraced in each other's arms and cried and cried. "I cannot believe you recall such details," said my father. "And that is indeed what happened. You were only 8 at the time, and you remember so much. It's extraordinary. Why didn't you tell me before?" he asked, looking perturbed. "Because I've only just remembered now," I said. "I've only just remembered everything now. Dad, you and Mum never ever fought. Why was Mum so angry that night?" I asked. My dad shook his head. "It was all down to that duplicitous secretary of mine that was working for me at the time. She was called Shirley, and she was a nasty, vindictive woman who was always trying to seduce me. I immediately fired her because she was behaving very inappropriately towards me, and it was becoming increasingly uncomfortable for me at the office. I couldn't stand that woman. She made my flesh crawl and was so aggressively flirtatious. I've never seen anything like it. As you can imagine, tongues were wagging all over the office because of the embarrassing overtures Shirley was making towards me. And she made no secret of the crush she had over me. She made it blatantly clear to everybody. I'd come to work and there would be a box of chocolates or fresh doughnuts on my desk from her. Not to mention little notes with little messages on it like, "Have a good day, boss. Love, Shirley." I promise you these women did not know the meaning, well, at least she didn't know the meaning of the word subtle. She'd arrive at work in skin-tight clothes, short skirts and low-cut blouses, leaving nothing to the imagination, and the dressing was definitely for me. I did talk to her about the way she was dressing at work, and told her that it was not the way I wanted her to present herself in front of our clients in our offices, because we were operating a very serious business. When I did tell her, finally, that I needed to sack her because of her inappropriate overtures towards me, she was furious and assured me that I would be very sorry for what I'd done. I had no idea what her idea of payback was, but I was to learn the very next night. When I returned home, the next day after I dismissed Shirley, your mother was acting incredibly standoffish towards me. I'd never observed her behave like that towards me before. That was when she started accusing me of having an affair with Shirley. I gathered the revengeful, spiteful Shirley was not packing any punches, and had phoned your mother and assured her that I was having an affair with her, which was anything but the truth. I even called her pigs in space behind her back, because she reminded me of a spaced-out pig. I think she would get high as a kite sometimes. Well, she looked like it anyway. I was flummoxed that your mother actually believed those acrimonious cow for the lies she was telling. It was extraordinary that your mother would actually believe it, but she did. Mum believed her? I asked in horror. You're the last person in the world that would cheat on your wife. Everybody knows that. Tell that to your mother, Janine. I was devastated that your mother would even believe such a callous lie, but it seemed that Shirley had done a fabulous, cunning job in convincing your mother that I was a terrible cheat. So how did Mum actually fall down the staircase, I asked. I did hear the tumble as she flew down the stairs, but what happened? Your mother wanted to retire to bed early that night, and I was adamant that we talked about things first. My father always used to say, never let the sun go down on your grief. I just wanted your mother to hear me out one more time, but she wasn't listening. She was standing with her back to the staircase, and I was facing her, trying to talk her round. And I remember she pushed me very hard, and then she tripped in her new shoes and lost her footing and went flying backwards down the stairs, where she landed. Oh, it was awful. Dad, I said, you should have informed the police about what happened. You put yourself through a living hell. All could have been avoided if you'd actually told the police. I'm sure the autopsy would have confirmed your account, and then you would have healed so much better. You've had to go through this all on your own for so many years. It's all so crazy. It's too late for that now, said my father. What's done is done. I think your Aunt Diane was convinced I'd go down for murder, and she felt that we needed to cover the accident up. She was very worried about what would happen to you kids if I was to be laid up in prison. There were so many considerations, but losing you kids was just not an option, not for me, nor for Diane. We couldn't let that happen. Not a chance. I was to find out from my father that Diane and my father had actually gone to the woods and buried my mother in a deep grave wrapped up in the Persian carpet. I persuaded my father to actually dig up my mother's remains and take them back to her burial site, as they would likely only be bones by now. We could dig a smaller grave and then place her bones at the proper plot at the cemetery, because my mother did indeed deserve a final resting place. And surprisingly enough, my father entirely agreed. Soon my father told my other siblings what had actually happened to my mother, and although they were sad, they really did not have enough of a memory of her to really grieve her. As far as my siblings were concerned, Diane was indeed their real mother, because growing up she was the only one that had filled my mother's shoes, and she was a brilliant mother at that to each and every one of us, so why would they be sad? One night my father, Eddie, and I went into the wooded area where my mother was buried, and my father found the spot where he believed the corpse would be found. So he began to dig while my brother and I stood around the grave, watching. My father dug, and just when we were getting close to the Persian carpet, the top of my father's trowel just broke off like that, and so he needed to return to the house to get another trowel from the yard shed. It was a very irritating event. I remember we were rather frustrated by this setback, but my father could not dig with the bottom of the trowel, so we had no choice but to wait for my dad to finally come back. I remember the night so clearly because it was incredibly creepy, sinister and airy, and even Eddie pointed out that there were no singing crickets, croaking frogs, or even owl calls, and the woods were incredibly quiet. You could have heard a pin drop. This was incredibly odd because we were used to the woods, and they were usually alive with owl calls and coyotes and all kinds of animals, but not tonight, not on this occasion. It was incredibly silent. We heard absolutely nothing, and it really did make us feel a little on edge. My brother and I were very uneasy, but we decided to wait by the grave, and moments after he had gone, we suddenly heard this thundering noise that sounded like a rhino in a thicket, and it was heading directly towards us at such a fast speed that Eddie and I were quite terrified. In truth, it sounded almost ghostly. It was almost supernatural in its sound. Immediately we went to hide behind an oak tree that overlooked my mother's resting place. We quickly turned off our flashlights, and thankfully it was a full moon that night, so the moonlight literally dappled the forest floor in a very pretty white light, and surprisingly we could see remarkably well. We heard the creature before we actually saw it. The critter was grunting, snorting and breathing very heavily, sounding unlike anything that I've ever heard before. Even but before I actually got to see the critter, I sensed it was colossal, because I could feel the powerful energy that it exuded, that made you fully aware that you were in the presence of an apex predator. Call it a sixth sense if you like. I cannot explain it, but you just sense and know it intuitively. When I peered around the tree, I saw the critter, and it was unlike anything that I've ever observed or seen before in my entire life. This thing was like a human giant. It was massive, and when I say huge, we are talking about Titanic. This creature would make a tall human being appear small and inconspicuous because it was about 11 foot tall, 5 feet wide, and easily over 1,000 pounds. The body was covered in long, shaggy, dark hair, which could have easily been auburn or very dark brown, but it was not light enough for me to distinguish the exact colour of the hair. The critter was very strong, sinewy, thick, muscular and burly, with very long, overlong arms and a cone-shaped face. I could not distinguish all the features of the face, but I did observe a very evident red eye shine. To my horror, the creature was observing the recently dug grave with a somewhat perturbed look on his face, as if he was saying, "What on earth is this, and what is it doing here?" He couldn't understand why there was a big square hollow in the middle of the woods, and he was scratching his head as though very confused. Suddenly he appeared to study it a little bit more closely and intently, with very keen eyes, as if something had suddenly caught his eye. To my horror, the critter jumped into the hollow and was digging away at the grave, working far more efficiently than my father had done, with a trowel, I might add. I watched it using its huge hands and sausage-like sized fingers, and finally it succeeded in dragging out of the ground a very large Persian carpet, which he unrolled. To our amazement, my mother's scant remains just fell out of the carpet, landing all over the forest floor, and it seemed that there were no more than a few little bones. The creature was very surprised by this, but he discarded my mother's bones like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle with very little interest. I could see he was far more interested in the Persian carpet itself, which for some reason, although having been buried for so long, was not in terrible condition, I might add. I would have expected the wool to have been eaten away, but it did not appear to be the case, which I thought was exceedingly peculiar. The creature was thrilled with the rug, because he began to make these delighted whooping sounds as if he'd found some long-lost treasure, and then he rolled the carpet, tugged it under his arms like a lightweight yoga mat, and glided away, whistling happily to himself. "What the heck was that?" asked my brother. "Did you see it?" I nodded. "It was like a cross between a human and an ape," I said. "I've never seen anything like it before. It's like a creature out of the Twilight Zone." My brother and I were so stunned by what we'd actually seen that we barely said a word to each other as we gathered what was left of my mother's bones that lay scattered across the ground. I was able to place them in my cardigan, and we began to throw all the soil back into the grave, and when my father finally did return, he was amazed that we'd recovered the bones and proceeded to fill in the grave with the bottom of the trowel. I think he assumed we had left the carpet in the grave, but we decided not to tell him the crazy thing that had actually transpired while he went back to the house to retrieve the trowel. My brother and I did not talk for many years about the strange critter that we had seen and observed in the woods, because we could not make any sense of the creature anyway. And we told no one. We told no friends, no family members, absolutely no one, because we didn't think in our gut that anybody would actually believe our story anyway. It sounds so incredulous, we found it hard to believe ourselves, so why should anybody believe us? I'm glad to say we were able to bury my mother's bone in her gravesite without anybody suspecting anything. We just looked like we were planting seedlings on her spot. We performed a very little ceremony for her around the grave and said our final farewells. It was a very sad and moving occasion. It was only after the burial that my father was able to move on, and he did marry a lovely lady called Christine. So about a year later or so, we ended up with 2 mothers and dads, which was so cool because by this stage in our lives, Diane and Larry were very much fixture and fittings in our lives, and we couldn't live without them. One day, many years later, we saw a program called Finding Bigfoot, and then my brother and I knew at once what we had seen that night in the woods, and we became incredibly excited. My father laughed and said, "There is no way that a creature like that could exist in our forests because we'd know about it." Eddie and I looked at each other and winked because we knew that Bigfoot was indeed real. So there you are. That's my story. All I can say is thank you for that incredible story. It really pulls at the heartstrings, and what an ordeal you had as a child and your father had. Oh, wow. I don't even know what to say. And as for the Bigfoot, thinking he'd found a lost treasure when he picked up that big rug, maybe he's going to carpet his cave with it. Who knows? Until next time, goodbye and good night.